Greetings out there to everyone watching us on the internet. I am John Welsh, a graduate student of Italian here at Harvard University, and I'm joined here today by our next guest in the De Bosis Colloquium in Italian Studies. Professor Raymond Jonas is professor of history at the University of Washington in Seattle, and he's here to talk with us today about his new book, The Battle of Adwa, African Victory in the Age of Empire. Professor Jonas, thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you, John. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I'd like to start off with a very basic question. Could you just set the stage for anyone who might not be familiar with the Battle of Adwa?
Sure. So the Battle of Adwa took place in the Ethiopian highlands on the 1st of March, 1896. And it was a confrontation between an Italian army and an Ethiopian army that resulted in a triumphal victory for Ethiopia and a disastrous defeat for Italy. The loss of life on the Italian side, out of about 18,000 men, was close to 6,000. They had almost 3,000 prisoners. The Ethiopian casualties were even higher, probably close to 20,000 out of maybe as many as 100,000. But they won. So at least for those who survived, the casualties were acceptable.
Now, in your book, you do a great job describing exactly why the Battle of Adwa is so crucially important. Could you say a few words about why this victory for Ethiopia was so important, not only for Italy and for Ethiopia, but for the future direction of world politics?
There were a couple of firsts that are built into the story of Adwa, and one of them is that this is the first time that an African army had definitively defeated a European army. I mean, there had been setbacks before. The British had a terrible setback in their war with the Zulu a few years earlier, but it was a setback. I mean, eventually, the outcome was never really in doubt. This was, I suppose, for someone thinking of U.S. history, something like Custer's Last Stand. That it was a serious defeat, but part of an overwhelming and unrelenting process. The victory of the Ethiopians was definitive. It meant that Ethiopian sovereignty was successfully defended, and that made Ethiopia the only African country not to be colonized during the period of high empire. That's astonishing to think about. It was astonishing then. It's still astonishing now. At the time, what made it especially, I think, important was that common sense in the late 19th century had it that Africa was going to suffer the fate that the Americas suffered, that they would be colonized and populated by Europeans. And Adwa, in a very dramatic fashion, put that scenario into doubt.
One of the aspects I most enjoyed in your book was telling about what happened both before and after the actual Battle of Adwa. And especially, I was impressed by the rise to power and the preparations made by Menelik.
Right.
Do you think it would be fair to say that the battle was really won before it even started?
Yes, there is a sense in which it was won, although I don't think anyone could have predicted Ethiopian victory. Looking back, we can say, yes, we can see how this unfolded in a way that strongly favored Ethiopian victory. But the way he does that is a complicated story. But in effect, he has to overcome some internal challenges. There are others who want to topple him, just as he tried to topple his predecessor. But he's a brilliant strategist, and it's part of the story is just to see how he makes the most of the limited resources he has in order to bring down a formidable opponent.
Now, the reaction to this unprecedented victory by the Ethiopians, by an African army, was difficult to understand, to grasp, both in Italy and abroad. And there were a number of really strange misconceptions. I recall the anecdote of a newspaper publishing a caricature of Menelik, clearly depicting him as a white man.
Yes, it's part of the challenge of defeat at Adwa is that this is a defeat not only of a European army, but it's a defeat by a black army, and it inverts the racial hierarchy of the day, which assumes European dominion over the world, and this not challenges the notion of dominion, but also upsets the notion of white superiority. And this has impacts around the world. In fact, in the States, one of the ways that I approached the topic was by looking at how the American press covered the story. And one of the earliest images of Menelik that went out in the American press showed an Ethiopian monarch who looked for all the world like he could be the Tsar of Russia. recently coronated. And then there were stories, too, that the Ethiopians weren't African at all, but in fact of Phoenician descent. There are different ways that people are struggling to come to terms with this very shocking outcome, trying to understand how this could happen, and ultimately interpreting the events in ways that take the racial hurt, the racial dimension of the story away.
Now, of course, there were African soldiers on both sides of
Yes.
the conflict, however.
Yes, the Italians learned early on, after some initial skirmishes, that the best way to increase the size of their army was to hire local soldiers, mercenaries in effect. They called escari. And they found that there were lots of advantages. They